Welcome. Thank you all so much for coming, at least on time, to our session on how to really support better engagement with businesses. We will talk about what we're calling, at least, the government business engagement standard, although I would say it's very much a work in progress and mirrors a lot of the iterative work that we do at Code for America, and you all will be part of that iterative process. Before I kind of go into what we think about economic development, why this is important to us, I really want to turn it over to Scott Mauvais from Microsoft. Microsoft has been really one of the leading supporters not only of our summit, but also of the economic development focus area in particular. They have really a lot of interest and passion for economic development, which I have found contagious and really makes me really excited, having joined Code for America just a few months ago, to really have such a great partner in Scott and Microsoft to think through this set of challenges with. So Scott, maybe you want to come on up here and just say a few words about what this means to you.
Thanks, Ephraim. So I just, some of our perspective, Microsoft has been passionate about sort of the world of economic development and really democratizing economic development. Since our earliest days, you think back to the first vision: desktop in every home, on every desktop, on every desktop in every home. And that was sort of revolution at the time of how do we democratize computing resources? And we really look at that across the board in everything we engage in. And we're really interested in thinking about how do we take the world of economic development and get cities more engaged in trying to expand the net of how they approach that. And we love to support people who are doing good work in that area, and that's something that we're really looking at doing. Not only is it morally the right thing to do, but we're a private enterprise. This is good for us in the business sense too. As those new companies form, they'll be our customers. And as we look at reinvigorating workforce development, getting more people into tech jobs, those will be workers in our industry that will fuel our growth and our customers' growth. So not only is this something that Microsoft just morally believes in, but it's aligned to our business interests. And I think that's important because I like citizenship. I like companies that go do the right thing. But my own view is when those aren't tied directly to business interests, you always have to worry about the sustainability. Will the priorities change? Will the profit motives change? And when they're aligned like they are, what we're trying to do, I think that you have a good roadmap for sustainability. And Code for America's ability to scale, their ability to work across the country, both in a variety of cities, in thought leadership, and convening sessions like this, is one of the reasons we really like to support the work they're doing.
Thanks, Scott. Really appreciate all the work you guys have done and the insight you've given me. I'm going to assume all of y'all on your computers and your iPads, tablets, Surface, cell phones, whatever they may be, are going to be tweeting and saying all the great things about our session. So you can remember hashtag CFA Summit. Code for America is Code for America's handle. My handle on Twitter is EasyBicer. Feel free to tweet questions or things at me. I'm happy to get back to you throughout the rest of the summit. I'm going to pass around some post-it notes. This is, as I mentioned, everything we do is highly iterative, and this is no exception. You all are helping us develop this standard. What does it actually mean for government and business to interact? What should that look like? So take a few Post-its, as maybe 3 or 4 each as we go around. This is a good opportunity to do, if you hear something, you see something that you really like, or that gives you a thought, write it down and share it with me afterwards. Or we'll have some time actually after I kind of go through this presentation for you all to share some bigger thoughts. So really looking forward to kind of seeing what that means. So as Scott mentioned, and as we share, really this is about how do we promote inclusive economic growth. I'm going to borrow Mayor Schaap's phrase, techquity, I think, pretty regularly from now on, because this really is what it's about. It's about ensuring that we have not only inclusive economic growth, but we focus on kind of the core areas where government and business interact, one, and that's what we'll focus on today. The other piece being the skills gap. We know that economic development and workforce development are intimately linked, and we can't talk about one without the other. So we know that's going to be an important element on that front. So to give you a little background, Code for America has worked a lot in economic development since its founding. We have a number of fellowship projects, some of which have spun out to be companies, some of which are still in use today in the markets where they were made. And you'll see here, this addresses a lot of those core government business interactions, right? We've got Blight status, about parcel data, same with local data. With parcel data, what information can we give you? Market data that's publicly available. We have Open Counter. Open Counter is what you've probably heard about the most, in part because they spun out, pretty successful company. Really, what's the permit? How do you do permitting? Permitting is that process that no one ever says, that was great. Open Counter makes it better because it helps put things online and tells you what you could do by right and what you need a variance for. And that's a huge, huge issue for businesses. Development FastPass has actually been integrated into Open Counter. Development FastPass was a project in Vegas that actually said, here's where you sit in the process. Where do you sit in your permitting process? We can move you through that pipeline. And this last one on the left here, we have Premier Peso, one of my favorites, in part because it was built in Puerto Rico last year. And what it basically says, and this is probably a story you've heard a lot, governments have business services and programs that businesses should be able to access, yet those are very hard to find. Doesn't matter. You don't know what, based on your industry, based on your size of business, your ownership model, which programs, some people call them incentives. I'll try to not use the I word too much today, to say that it's really about getting the right resources to the right businesses. And how do you do that? Premier Peso took what's a very tough process and made it 5 or 6 simple questions to tell you which programs, in Puerto Rico's case, incentives that you're eligible for. So why do we care about economic development? I mean, this is like, of all the core services that we believe government should deliver, why does economic development matter to us? Why did we choose that as one of our 4 focus areas? One, if we had a mayoral roundtable in January, when you ask mayors what they care about, they say economic development. When you ask people what they care about, they say jobs. And it's clear that this is something that people really are interested in. There's something that's very passionate about. Their livelihoods depend on it. So how are we supporting that? Because government, as we know, why you all are here, plays a really interesting role in supporting those interactions. We also know that since coming out of the recession, not everyone is benefiting. Not everyone is seeing that growth. Not everyone is getting a job. In New Orleans, 52% of working age black men are not working. And so that's a big deal. We have the highest rates of youth unemployment since the Great Depression, and we are coming out of the recession, right? We are this now very strong economy, having recently seen record stock market numbers. We still have high unemployment for youth, and that's got all sorts of issues. And things are changing. We know now economic development as a field is different. The world is changing, markets are changing, other markets are growing, and that requires us to think a little differently about how we approach the set of tools. I'm gonna try to play a video right now, so bear with me if the technology works. If it doesn't, if the sound doesn't work, I will narrate this, do my best Bruce Katz impression.
For decades, the United States built its economy on debt and consumption. For cities, this meant throwing public money at sports arenas and stealing businesses from their neighbors with tax breaks. But what about after the game? You can't build an economy around beer and hot dogs. And what happens when the businesses you stole leave for a better deal somewhere else? The Great Recession was a wake-up call. We forgot the fundamentals. Productive and innovative growth drive consumption, not the other way around. Smart metro leaders are going back to basics, investing in infrastructure, making manufacturing a priority again, connecting small businesses with investors in new markets, helping workers get the skills they need. If metros get the basics right, the beer and hot dogs will follow.
And I didn't play that just because I'm a huge fan of the growing craft beer industry. I played that because our economic development challenges are different. We've spent so much time trying to play the zero-sum game where we steal businesses from one city to another, and ultimately, that's not working. We have to think about how to get new businesses off the ground, how to help businesses grow, and cities play a really key role in that. There's a number of services, resources, permits, licenses, you name it, that governments have to do, and that really could all work better. So ultimately, when we talk about economic development, the thing everyone cares about is jobs. So the question is, where do jobs come from? Is there a jobs fairy, jobs stork that just kind of runs around, flies around, and shows up with jobs? No, it doesn't usually work that way. But oftentimes, when we determine the success of our economic development efforts, we talk about economic development. So Brookings Institution has done some really interesting research on what actually leads to job creation. This is some national numbers. So again, we talked about that relocation piece. That's the smallest element of job creation in the United States. And in fact, if you think about it from a metro perspective, many metros actually have negative job creation from relocation, made up by increased job creation from startups and expansions. Startups in this case doesn't just mean tech startups, it means all forms of business creation. So anytime a new business license is pulled, it would be considered a startup. So that tells us a couple things. It tells us, one, if we really care about economic development, we're talking about how to help businesses get off the ground. And two, it means we're helping businesses grow, businesses that are already in our markets. That's what's going to be really, really important. And we also have to think, how are we allocating resources for those services? If you ask yourself, how many people do you have in your office of small business, and how many people do you have spending your time attracting businesses? I guarantee you those things don't line up with this statistic. Pretty sure. So how do we ensure, though, that those, as Scott mentioned, democratize that level of service? Because we know when we want to bring that company that's going to bring these amorphous 200 jobs to our region, we throw everything at them. They get all sorts of people. We find everyone's calendar is cleared to make it work. Because it's easy, right? We're going to go after one company for 200 jobs, and we may or may not get it. But meanwhile, there's 20 companies, each of whom could create 10 jobs. That's 200 jobs. Plus, they're already local. They have those local connections. We know those multipliers are there. So what are we thinking about? And how are we allocating those services and getting that same level of service that we could give to that big company that could afford the lawyer, and the permit expediter, and the consultant, and the lobbyist who help navigate all that process? How do we ensure small businesses trying to grow, or those entrepreneurs trying to get their businesses off the ground, can get the same level of service, same access to information? That is what this is all about. And then when we talk about an engagement standard, it's really, what does that look like? Local governments are not just regulators of business, they are catalysts, they're investors. Tax dollars go into a variety of programs, whether it's a storefront improvement program designed to make a street look prettier, create more inviting environment for people to want to hang out there, all the way to revolving loan funds, where businesses or governments are actually becoming investors in businesses by taking out debt. Now, we talk about startups. This is a pretty interesting stat. The United States is ranked 46th in the world as the easiest place to start a business. That is not what you would think about for the most powerful economy on earth. We should be doing better. And the truth is, we have to. We have to, because if we really want to achieve tequity, right? If that's what it's about, if it's about getting more people into jobs, the people who need the jobs the most, we have to become an easier place to start a business, and an easier place to grow a business. Now, you've heard us talk a lot about 21st century government, so I'm going to take a second and go through a few slides that are broad 21st century government that we would apply to any of our focus areas, not specifically economic development. After we do that, we're going to actually apply these to economic development. This is a great time to be using those Post-it notes. If you see something, you're like, hey, I want to apply that to economic development. What would that look like? Write it down, because when we this really is a conversation. This is not set in stone. We don't know the full answer to this yet. We have some ideas, and we really want to make sure that get some input from you to see if those are the right ideas. Many of you are working day in and day out with businesses. You're in government. We want to hear what you have to say. Does this even resonate with you in the first place? So first, strategy is delivery. Another way of saying this, user-centered design. The government is, the center is users. As Jake said today, he goes users, operations, then you can get to the policy, eventually law. But it always starts with users. Now, what does government look like right now? It looks like this old process where policymakers, they do policy, they then put up regulations. After that's done, they create systems, then maybe they test it, and then we're done. And usually what that means is we took 5 years to develop, we took a year to write an RFP, we took 1 year to select the thing, we took 3 years to actually implement it, and then it took us 5 years from release of RFP to having it online, if that's quick. And then because we invested so much money in it, we have to sit with it for 10 years. And so here we are. This is how you have these permitting systems from 1990, 1985, still being used today in government. And I know I'm seeing nodding heads because you all know that there's like those generation old systems. So really, what should government look like? And again, sorry, the font got messed up here, but users first. Users first. And from users, we design services and we redesign those services. After we redesign those services, we actually put a system in place. We then think about the policy. And ultimately, there's feedback. There's feedback loops because it's not done. It's never done. Remember, governing is a process, not a result. So what is this kind of standard that we're talking about? And again, it's less of a standard, more of a set of practices for effective delivery. In general, this is what we would say 21st century government looks like. These are a few things. You'll see more about these throughout the week, and everything we talk about really goes back to these 7 principles. This is, of course, first, we're starting with people's needs. We know where they're at. We know where to find them. We actually are working with real people, and that's where the beginning of our process comes from. We ensure everyone can participate. You know, an example you heard earlier from Jack, and he's talking about, oh, I have a problem with something. All right. Jack said, I have a problem with something. The reason I have a problem with something is because, and I want to go say something, I have to go to take time off from work and go to a public meeting. That's not everyone being able to participate. How do we make it so that everyone can participate? And make it easy to understand. Government is not exactly known for its communicating things in a way that lacks jargon. It's used a lot of buzzwords. But really, how do you make it so that anyone who may or may not be a regular interact with government? Start small and continuously improve. You heard us, I think it was Jonathan Fellman on stage, mentioned how excited he was when someone mentioned minimally viable product. That's what this is all about. How do you test things? Because we have to make sure that we're iterative and that we're thinking about how to get things done with the least resources possible. Use real-time data. Things happen in real time. We have to track these things. We know that information can be done in real time. It was really interesting. One of the findings with challenges with healthcare.gov was that you couldn't actually track where someone got lost. And healthcare.gov didn't know they were down until CNN broadcasted it. So that's a problem because what you need to know is what's happening in real time. How are people actually using the systems and where are they falling out? Of course, things need to be open. You can imagine when it comes to economic development data and resources, there's information. There's a lot of that could be open. But we know that things need to be open and available. People matter. We can say all the right things about technology, but if you don't have the right people on your team, it doesn't matter. If you don't have the people, if you're not thinking about the way technologists are engaged in your team. We were doing a design workshop earlier today, and someone asked, well, do I need a designer to do this? Maybe as a facilitator, but on your team, you want people who have that thought process, who are thinking this way, regardless if they are a, quote unquote, designer or not. And you're making informed technology choices. Now, sometimes you need to buy technology. Sometimes you're going to build technology. Sometimes you might not need technology at all. And technology becomes not the answer to the problem. Sometimes it's a process improvement that can happen putting the right people in the same room. Technology, though, can often facilitate that. So let's apply those 7 things to governments, interaction with businesses. And these are things we've learned from those prior fellowship projects. This list is not in stone, and I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback and input on what you think actually makes sense. Like I said, don't take this as our official position on how government should be interacting with businesses. There's actually some really interesting things here where a lot of questions, and you'll see on each of these slides, there's a series of questions about what does this actually mean. So one is just, do we actually understand the needs of businesses? Who are our businesses? What do they need? Why do they come to the city in the first place? Are they coming because they're trying to get off the ground? Do they need a event permit? Our team in Miami found one of the major issues in Miami-Dade County was getting event permits. Really stinks. It's way harder to just put a tent up in a park than it probably should be. But we think about what it means for who our businesses are. And what are the ways in which a business touches government? So we've heard this story a few times where someone says, oh yeah, once I hand them their permit, they're able to open their business. And then someone else raises their hand and says, actually, no, after you hand them their permit, I hand them a permit, then they can open their business. And that cycle probably continues a few times. And what that says is the government folks often don't know where those businesses are in the process. And they just assume that when they're done, the business is good to go. And that's not always the case. Now, maybe those savvy consultants, they know, oh, well, you got to go through this department and that department and this department. But the average business owner just sees government as government. And if we want to have people trust government, they have to have every one of those experiences has to be positive. And everyone's got to have some basic knowledge of what's going on. So map out your business process. We started this in our design workshop earlier, but do you actually know what your business process looks like? Do you know how long you should expect to be in one of those processes? So the city of San Diego did something that was really interesting. They found that it took about a month to determine if someone sent in the right documents. This is before you even get into plan review. Yes or no, did you send in the right documents? It took them a month to get through that process. This is an example of a non-tech solution to thinking about some of these problems. They found that process took a month. They could shorten the business process by a month by somehow changing that. What they created was a certification program for business owners and developers that if you went through their class, which said you understand all of the right documents, you could skip that first process because we assume based on your knowledge of our process, you can get through this. That translated into a 4-week shorter process for most development projects, ultimately making the process easier for businesses. And that's an example of what happens if you map this out, how you can identify opportunities to make things work just a little better. I think it's also important to know that there's what government thinks is happening and what businesses are actually experiencing. So they're not always the same. We know that sometimes businesses are saying, I'm walking, literally walking in many cases, from one department to another. And government assumes that they're just going through a process of checking off the boxes. That may not be how both sides of that party are experiencing that set of issues. So build out robust feedback loops. Again, remember, feedback is that important element of what 21st century government looks like. So how are businesses responding to what's going on? Our project in Miami, you'll hear about that on Friday on the main stage, but to kind of provide a high-level overview, one of the things they're really interested in is what does it feel like to go through a development process? Who do you interact with? Are you getting positive customer experience? And I don't like using the word customer, but in this case, are you getting a good interaction with the folks you're working with? And then what happens when that feedback comes in? How do you actually know if they receive that feedback? And does something actually happen with it? Miami right now has been using basically a 5x7 card to do all of their feedback. And it's only done in-house at the where you go to pull your permits. None of it's online, none of it's digital. And right now, that information doesn't go anywhere. Doesn't actually change the process. So what you see is people actually just want to say how great we are, how great the city is, because they don't want the city to turn around and say that they're hurting their jobs because, take kind of the revenge. If you give a bad review, they give you bad service. And you know how that might, at a restaurant or something like that, that's a very real reality. This is really important. This is what Premier Peso really told us, and what we learned from Open Counter, that information needs to be online, needs to be searchable and dynamic. So what we know is that in Puerto Rico, there were 35 incentive programs across 15 departments. And to get access of any one of those incentives, you had to go individually to each incentive page, manager, et cetera. That was not effective. And what that meant was businesses were falling off. They weren't considering Puerto Rico as a location. They weren't growing in Puerto Rico. So what Premier Peso did is it put all that information online, made it searchable, and searchable based on your specific needs, which is really, really important, again, because it's user-centered. Now, it's also important to push it out. So our team in Pittsburgh we're doing a lot of work. One of the things they learned about procurement was cities have a do a bad job of actually saying when RFPs are going out. They don't know, businesses don't know when they can submit proposals to become contractors with government. So they developed a tool that actually, based on your type of business, you can sign up to receive the RFPs, information about the RFPs that matter to you, and you can know 2 weeks before they're going to be released that they're going to be released. And this becomes really important. Again, it's unique. So you're not pushing about all the information about all incentives, or all contracts. You're pushing out the information about the businesses or the RFPs that actually matter to that business. So if someone does fleet maintenance or does lawn maintenance, and they want to get a contract to manage parks, they're only seeing information about that. We're not giving this deluge of information where things are hidden. I think Jack also put up that example of what it looks like when someone needs to go to a public meeting. It's just like pursuant, blah, blah, blah. And then it says a lot of mumbo jumbo that no one really understands. This is how you make it simple and user-friendly. That you give information, the right information to the people who need it. So the standard is the highest level of services you provide, highest level of service you provide to businesses. So what does this mean? This goes back to the point that says, when a business wants to come, you're able to rally the entire team to give them that level of support. How is it that you can give that same level of service to small businesses? These are the businesses who need help. They have many of the same questions. You may not be able to spend as much time with them. And this is where technology can become a resource, because now you can use that technology to provide the same amount of information, guidance, etc., to those businesses. I used to work at an economic development corporation, so we would do this. My job was to kind of talk to those big companies, give them a whole bunch of information, usually in 60-page increments of all sorts of data about the region. We would spend all of our time compiling that information, and it wasn't actually made clear to the small businesses. They would never get that level of information. They never saw that same level of service. And so how do we give that same level of service to those small businesses? And that should be the standard of what small businesses should expect, what we as government and the folks trying to make government work better should expect government to deliver. Then the piece of that is who needs to be involved. So sometimes that means that you've got multiple departments working together. You have the cross-functional teams working on that set of business issues. Use the right technology. I think the philosophers of TLC said it right when they said, don't go chasing waterfalls. We spend our time, government does this really great thing where, well, great is sarcastic because government does this great thing. They set all these great pyramids, right? It's just it's a straight line. If we go up like this, and we're gonna build a tool. I was at this presentation last week, and a guy said, here's what we did. We did exactly that old paradigm of government, right? We talked to the government users. We then built something internally. We had this policy we were implementing, and right before we released it, we tested it with businesses. At that point, you've invested how many millions of dollars, years of time, not the right approach. What we would say is start from the user needs and iterate, start small. Well, what makes some of our fellowship tools so successful is that they're very, very focused on very specific problems. They're very small. They are able to start with the user and move out. And what we've seen with things like our work in CalFresh is that we're butting up against policy. We're butting up against some of those operational issues that now we can take a chance at fixing. Some of those issues, as Jake mentioned earlier today, are not technological. It's that fact that a form was being sent out that was some kind of holdover from a former policy. And we can get rid of that document, and that changes, that now allows more people to get on CalFresh. So I mentioned this as an iterative process. I don't know if some of you may have caught on Twitter, I was going back and forth with Mark Head, and he asked this question. He said, what if we presented user impact statements the same way we made governments do fiscal impact statements? So, it's great, and I added that to this because I think that is actually really interesting. We spend so much time trying to figure out what's going to happen fiscally or financially if we change how we deliver a service. We don't actually determine if that affects the users, and the users in this case being businesses. So should we be having without adding levels of approvals, because that doesn't actually speed up government either, and we know this, but how do we ensure that we're asking the right questions about the user experience when we want to make changes and improvements, or what we could perceive to be improvements at least? And last, one of the things having worked in economic development, having seen economic development professionals, is they work hard. They do good work. They are extremely good at building those relationships that matter, and we have to allow those teams to play to their strengths. So when you think about what an economic development professional looks like and what those teams need, there needs to be some digital competency. I think one of the, oftentimes we want to centralize all IT and tech functions. The truth is, having some tech functions inside each department is probably a better way. Or for certain things, for certain functions, design and user experience testing, having something in-house, if you can have it, if you're a big enough department, is really important, and probably one way to achieve that. At the very least, the staff you have are thinking about these challenges this way, whether or not they are developers who can code in Ruby or Python or any of the other languages. You know, one of the thoughts is, if you think about like the International Economic Development Council and other groups that train economic development professionals, how are these ideas of design thinking and user-centered design embedded into those trainings? Because they're the ones who bring all of the content expertise. And we also know that economic development is inherently cross-functional. And economic development professionals are not usually the ones issuing permits. Usually we're the ones shepherding a company through a process, one that includes the fire department, maybe on a certificate of occupancy. You've got a building permit, maybe you need a variance, maybe not. If you need that variance, how long is that going to take? Those are all things that we need to have that team ready to rock and roll. And economic development, therefore, is cross-functional, and we have to think of kind of the economic development professional, the economic development team, as inherently cross-functional. So that is kind of my draft. It's a draft. It is a start. We know that there's a lot of work to do. We know that there's a lot of types of services we need to learn more about. And there's, you all in this small room have a lot of insight. And I'd like to use the rest of our time to kind of have you shout out, discuss with each other. I guess we'll try to get the mic around. What you think the effective government business interactions should look like. Did any of these things resonate with you? Not resonate with you? How do we take it further? How do we really identify some of those core things that make sense? So we have about 20 minutes. And so I want to use this time really hear from you. I'm really excited. There's a ton of expertise in this room. So I want to kind of hear from you what you think are some of the next best steps. So with that, I guess use the mics. We're trying to record everything. So if you could pass the mic around, that would be really helpful. I think it's on. It's on. Cool.
Hi. It occurs to me in listening to this that this is a fundamentally different question than the engagement question that we were talking about in the other room in the session before this, in that if you're trying to plan a park, for example, there's a constituency that wants a dog park, maybe there's a constituency that wants a tot lot, and you're going to have this discussion about what you should build. Within, in my experience, there's no business that wants a more complicated process or a higher fee. So I think deciding what to do is almost more of a revealed preference thing than an expressed preference, and that simplifies the whole question to me. So you can have the whole discussion, and it's more interesting to talk about how to structure your government in such a way that you don't need to charge a higher fee, or that you can have a simpler process, but you don't need to ask a business, should we make this more complicated or, simpler, because you know what they want in advance, and that you don't need to have a survey, you don't need to have an engagement process. You know that. You just know that. So I think that's an important point, is that this kind of engagement is fundamentally different than regular community engagement.
In some cases, people do want it more complicated. In some cases, incumbents will want it more complicated because they will use it as a barrier to entry. So, well, I'm going to keep my mouth shut.
I will do my best to move this microphone around as quickly.
So I just want to compound on that. In the city of Newark, we don't have digital applications, so they would actually pay more just to have the process easier. Currently, the process to get a license is 12 months. We got that down to 30 days via an application that we created. But they were out of 100 surveys, 99 said I would pay more if I could just do it from my home instead of coming to City Hall.
And I think that's an interesting point. One of the things we find is that it's less about cost and sometimes more about certainty. And so sometimes businesses are saying, I would rather pay a little more if it means I can get it done in 60 days as opposed to who knows how long it could take. So I think that's a really interesting element. One of the things we've also seen is that some places have permit expedites, where if you want to go into a second tier of permitting, you can just pay more, or you create a project that is actually sustainable or has affordable housing, or see things like that. So we know it's possible to make this process work better. So how do we just make that work for everyone so that it's working at that same speed?
So I get the protocol in terms of service delivery and process improvement. I'm a little more confused by the policy development aspect of it. So if I go and ask a business what's important to you, they're not going to say reducing my carbon emissions. Some of them will, but mostly not high on the priority list. Yet as a community, we need to reduce our carbon emissions pretty dramatically. So we're certainly engaging businesses in talking about how to do that, but we, from 20 years of experience in energy efficiency, we know they're not going to voluntarily reduce their energy use. We know that regulations are required. So, if we start from the user, we don't end up at a policy for reducing carbon. So there is a starting point sometimes where we say, here's the policy objective. Now you can all work with us and figure out how we get there in a way that's going to be not as painful as it might be otherwise. But I guess that I'm confused by the policy aspect of it.
So I think it's an interesting question. I would say that perhaps where it would matter the most is where there's service delivery. And I think the service delivery is really important. So at least in this case, we're talking about, I think you see this, right? Where it's like a core time where government and a business interact. And sometimes it's a regulatory experience, and sometimes it's not necessarily a regulatory experience. I think that there's a challenge in how do you take some of those values and apply some of those to those regulations. And I think, where we are is, we'd have to figure out what happens if we were to go map out the process of regulating a business for carbon emissions. There could be something that you would learn about how to better deliver that policy.
No,
and I would say that sometimes it's the where regulations get caught up, not in the law itself. So you kind of if you kind of work backwards from, okay, there's a policy in place. How do you make sure the regulations are the right ones and written as clearly as possible?
Well, I also think that goes right back to the cost versus certainty thing, because there's a cost to complying with that regulation has to do with the community as a whole. That regulation would have to do with the community as a whole, and so it's still a cost versus certainty. If they know that regulation's there and it's going to be enforced, and they can't go talk to their commissioner or whoever their elected official and get around it and make it unpredictable, then you've got your certainty back. So that.
I would just suggest also that you make sure that you have all levels of government engaged with this, because I work for a county, and we have to we're continually blindsided by what municipalities do. And those of you who work for municipalities will be saying, "Oh, those counties." Yeah. So, but ultimately, everybody, in order for this to succeed, everyone has to be on the same page and engaged at the same level, in my opinion.
I think that's right. And we also know there's state laws that matter. In California, if you have to do a CEQA at any moment or given time, that's a piece of state legislation. The Coastal Commission in California has another regulatory burden. So we know there's different levels of government. I think from our perspective, local government, and I think in many cases local government is both cities and counties. We may use them interchangeably, especially in counties with unincorporated land where they are delivering the same services as cities. That is where citizens and government most regularly interact in a direct way. Although for certain projects, the level gets higher. There's also federal programs that businesses don't know about. Bruce Cass says, I mean, to access new markets, do we know about all the export-related programs that are available, export financing options? No. So we have to think about how could something like Premier Peso not only tell you about local programs, but also connect you to those state and federal programs that could be beneficial.
But this is where government silos most get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's where we fall flat, because we get in our own ways because we've created these silos, and ideally we will take those silos down so we don't have this issue.
Well, I'll say our Miami-Dade County fellowship team was doing this work in Miami-Dade County, which is different than the city of Miami. And one of the things we've seen in a number of other projects is they started kind of like a where am I app is one of the first things they built because you don't actually know what jurisdiction you need to submit your forms to. If you're you don't even know what city you're in, much less if the county has if there's a health regulation that's actually done by the county and you are in an incorporated city. So that's a whole set of, I think, when we map out that process, one of the things that came out in our last session was that at some point the state becomes something you got to get a permit from or a license from. And if you don't, if you forget about that, then you get to the point where you're ready to open and the state says no, even though the local government says, oh yeah, you're good to go in our book. So I think there's definitely some elements there about that process. And I think there's a hand in the back.
So I think one of the things that we've been talking a lot about, streamlining permitting and those kinds of things that are, as you were saying, that's a good thing, that most people are going to want. But I think an important part of economic development is trying to set the vision for what the economy should be, what kinds of jobs do you want, what industries. And so one of the things that you put up there and went through quickly is, and I think that civic tech and this kind of field can teach economic development, is about how to use data in different ways to understand your economy. And I just working with economic development organizations, I know a lot of them don't have that kind of capacity. So I think that's, design, obviously, those kinds of things are important, but more research capacity, more data analytics would be helpful as well.
I think that's right on. And there's another element of this, which is oftentimes cities create these well-marketed, very beautiful economic development strategies, which would say anywhere from not a whole lot to a lot on paper, but extremely difficult to implement. And where the thing is an important business engagement piece there is, what should that strategy look like? What are the types of services businesses are asking government to invest in? What types of data are they asking government to manage and share? Those are parts of economic development strategy that, at least from my experience, are lacking. Right now you see, staff get together, they have one public workshop and they call it public engagement. But whereas there could be some really good opportunities to engage businesses and community members in saying, well, what do we want our community to look like? What are the businesses that are growing? What services do they really need from government to be more successful?
I think another important question we're kind of taking as a basis for this discussion that there's a legitimate policy reason for the city to be involved in a given topic. And I know in our case, one time we were looking at our special event permit process and we realized that the way we had the rules configured, if someone had a large Super Bowl party at their house, we were trying to redesign a permit process that would allow them to more easily move through our system and have every department look at their application for their Super Bowl party. And we realized the best thing we could do for the community is just completely get out of that space. We have a nuisance ordinance, so if they're too loud, we can ask them to quiet it down. If they're causing a traffic hazard, we can abate that. But there was no reason for us from a regulatory standpoint to be in that space. And I think the if question is really important. It's important not to assume that we have a legitimate reason to be doing this thing, but to actually think okay, is there a public benefit in our regulating this activity? And then if so, try and make the process as streamlined as possible. But maybe the answer is no.
That's a big question. I think it's far more common, especially as we go to an internet age, and you think, what type of regulation does an internet business need? One person was saying an example of, she had an online business. There was no brick and mortar facility. To get a business license, she needed a certificate of occupancy. And so what does that mean when we think about a business process? Do we understand the barriers to people getting off the ground? If people want to start businesses, Etsy and that kind of maker space is growing. That's something that there's a lot of people trying to figure out how to better support that set of industries. Maybe that's a tool or a set of tools about and how you change the regulatory environment to think about where does an online business need to be regulated, and then kind of stop there and allow them to get off the ground. We'll hear them in the back.
So my quick question is, what's your standpoint on the battle between creating more different independent licenses rather than doing one generalized business license that covers a lot of different grounds? Because the problem that we're having is one business has to go to get 4 different licenses for, let's say, a convenience store, which then they individually have to take out a day off of their job to come to City Hall and to walk through to the individual department. So what standpoint would you go on that? One general license, like New Orleans did, which is a general $75 license, which I feel like they are making a profitable margin there, or several like 32, 35 different licenses?
That's a good question. I think so. Clearly, like a bike shop and a coal-fired power plant don't need the same level of regulation. And so I think the question is, how do you regulate each one of those types of businesses the appropriate amount? Maybe there's one, like if there's a business that doesn't need to go through of other departments and all they need is the license, that's it. All they get is the license and they're good to go. I think there's other permits and other regulations they need to get through that based on their type of business. So if you are for whatever reason, you're a more regulated business, you may have to go through a few more steps.
So compounding on that, just a suggestion, what would you suggest if, oh man, it just blanked. I was just about to ask you the question. I just can't remember it. Damn.
Let me go in the back here,
Yeah.
and then maybe we'll come back to you.
So most of the examples of business engagements we've been talking about have been permit licensing transactions that do border on regulatory, but I think collaboration and participation are other aspects of business engagement that government could use tools and platforms for engaging with their businesses. I'm in the city of San Jose, and we see that, especially for our largest corporations, community engagement is part of the value that our Office of Economic Development can provide by, inviting them to give back, whether it's through volunteer days with our parks department or sponsoring big festivals, that sort of thing. At the same time, we need to coordinate our asks across departments so that, parks, libraries, and, the cultural office are not all asking for sponsorships, within the week in a disorganized way. So having a way to coordinate that kind of collaboration, and we even have, we have companies that want to participate. Their workforce is a resource, even if they don't live in the city, and they want to provide their tech workers as volunteers to help hack on civic apps. So, how do we do that kind of engagement as well, not just getting them through the permit process as fast as possible?
I got like all these looking at me. I think that's interesting. It's interesting because clearly there's a need to engage businesses on a variety of levels, and it comes back to kind of where the core services of government and what those tend to look like. I think the tools that businesses have, so there's like CRMs that kind of handle a lot of that. I think there's probably some of the answers in that type of a type of solution that looks like that. I think it goes back to the point before, which was there's a lot of reasons to engage businesses beyond just like helping them better navigate, as you mentioned, the permitting story. I think we have spent our time there initially because that tends to be where the first kind of service is delivered, where business first touches government, and we have to do a better job of getting that process done. But as you see things like City Voice and some of the other tools we're building around other needs in communities to engage residents around the needs, what they want to see happen in their neighborhood. I think similar tools like that could be applied to kind of those elements of business engagement. Misha.
So we've been talking in general a lot about service delivery of one kind or another, but economic development is many economic development professionals wouldn't think of themselves as service delivery professionals. They think about themselves as strategists, and they wouldn't think about users really, except in the broadest sense of citizens, and even then it would be indirect. So I'm curious as for the room to reflect on what are some of the other areas that that economic development professionals play in that actually are held back right now by the tools and processes that are not specifically service oriented. Like, for instance, deciding what industries you want, as someone said, in your city, right? Oh. Wow. Okay.
That point again. Thanks. I mean, like the chart that you put up there, I think that most economic development organizations would be very surprised to find out that 1% of their businesses come from recruitment efforts, where that's where they spend a huge amount of their time and a huge amount of their resources. So again, when you're talking about the vision, what kind of economy you want to have, it's about being proactive about what kind of community you want to have and what kind of economy you want to have, rather than being reactive to what your existing businesses say they need, because those things are really important. The permitting and transactions, I mean, I think we all have experienced that stuff really does matter, but as you say, it's just one part of the role.
And I don't really have an answer to this, but that brings up one of the discussions we've been having in our office, is to move ourselves away from strictly a targeted industry type of approach, but still manage to set the table to help all comers. Because I found the targeted industry approach, a lot of the economic development offices I work with, other organizations, they're trying too hard to twist the community into what the vision needs to be, and they haven't engaged all the stakeholders the way they need to. So you get this beautiful plan, but you come to find out you got to do all this infrastructure things, and nobody's going to sell you the land, and you can't eminent domain it. And so you started with a wrong premise because you did not engage the stakeholders with the right questions, I guess is kind of where I'm going with this, because we've got one particular plan. It's gorgeous, changing things, a nice mixed-use community, focused on talent attraction, all that kind of stuff. But every parcel owner is out of state. They only care about their revenue stream. They did not have any input on the plan, and will never be able to do it. And it's been sitting on the shelf for 5 years. So now we're having to go back and start all over, so.
So just on thinking through, what industries we want. I'm a technologist, not an economic development person, so that's sort of where this question is coming from. But putting my sort of faux libertarian hat on, I'm wondering, do we have the data that shows, one, that cities guess right and they pick the right industry, and even if they do, they're able to execute on that? And it's an honest question. I just don't, if we thought through what industries we wanted, is that the best use of resources?
We're going through right now bringing a casino to North Jersey. Hudson County, Essex County, and Bergen County are on the docket voting for it. Basically, it's all profitability, subsidies. It's all about money. I mean, we really just got to say, what are they asking for, and are we going to make the money off the property tax in itself? I mean, that's what it rudimentary comes down to. And I want to compound on yours because of an old administration or same administration. And I remember my question is, how do you deal with past ordinances or effectively engaging council members or the mayor and effectively proactively doing the right thing and saying, yeah, we have to look back and restructure the plans that we are really halting instead of getting some progress on that? Like, how would you suggest on an economic standpoint to kind of engage that when you're just bottom of the totem pole and you're not a level one kind of person?
I guess I'll try to answer that. I think there's a few things. One, it's been fascinating. One of the things that we've seen with CFA's engagement in some of these cities is it's two things that lead to our success. One is that the executive leadership, the policymakers, want to see some of those things be revealed. They're hearing someone is having a challenge, right? So they're hearing businesses are having a challenge. When businesses are asked what the problem is, all too often businesses say regulation. They are not able to say which specific things. And when you ask economic development professionals what the issue is, they'll just say regulations. And again, we have this conversation. We do not know. When you just say regulations, we can't do anything with that. So what I think our process has allowed us to do is say, well, here's actually where that problem is happening. So the problem may not be regulatory. The problem actually may be the delivery of the regulations that are on the book. So if we start by fixing, by staying within the policy ramifications, start there, and then you can say, well, hey, maybe we're hitting policy, we're hitting a regulatory change. That's where we need to go, and that requires maybe a small ordinance change. But I think it's going with the case and saying we've used data, we've taken this iterative approach, we've revealed some of this, and we also know it can work better because we're seeing it. We've developed, in our case, a prototype that says it could work better, and we know now what little, changes along the way can make that impact. Yeah, me too. So this is.
So I'm a first timer at CFA, but the independent brigades and the fellows for the independent cities, is there like a complete like case study or a report that they can actually publicize that, you know, kind of shows tendencies or kind of, you know, some traction, some you know, reports that other municipalities or governments can kind of read and say, hey, okay, they're like, for instance, Colorado did a great digital billboard program where they provided marketing and advertisement for small businesses on a digital billboard that was owned by the city. Now, I read that up and I contacted their economic development corporation, received the business plan, kind of helped us do the same thing. So is that the CFA does the same or no?
So I think we're almost out of time. I'd say we definitely have case studies where our brigades and our fellows have done exactly what you've described. And you can go online, you can see the videos from past summits. All of that's online. You can see what those look like and understand kind of what those successes are. I think that's probably the first ring of that, and it's, you know, also easy enough for us to connect you to the government partners we worked with to say not only did the tool have an impact, but and in some cases the government practices around it actually change. Remember, this is not about us just building tools; it's about us actually encoding a set of practices that government that would actually help government better work with businesses. So I think we have time for maybe one or two comments.
As a brigade co-captain, I would love to know what we would find helpful. Like, we don't know what is our target.
Initiatives, you know.
We can talk after that.
It just, the thought I've had while listening to some of this is that there's a much bigger problem in economic development just with regard to the way that cities, counties, states, and interact with each other. The stadium example that you were showing, we all end up doing that because we're looking for retail sales tax revenue, increased property taxes, we're looking for jobs in our jurisdiction, and then we want to be able to measure those metrics for our individual cities instead of thinking in a much broader sense that what is good for the city next door is also good for our city. We end up, and that's that bigger layer that needs to be fixed. And I know, you know, there's think tanks and all sorts of different, you know, people looking at this issue, but until that fundamental problem is addressed, cities will continue to operate that way and act like that, and it is a hindrance to economic development, I think, in general.
Sure. It is 5:30, and I think this session is between you and a reception of some kind. So I will say we can kind of close things there. I just want to say thank you all so much for participating in this session. I really appreciate all the feedback. I think you have some great thoughts and ideas. If you wrote on your Post-it notes, I really want to see what you wrote down. I'm really excited to think through it. My email, I think, is somewhere, but it's Ephraim@codeforamerica.org. I'm really looking forward to staying in touch with all of you. I would look forward to hearing more comments, more thoughts about what effective business government engagement looks like. And, you know, we've got a few more sessions throughout the summit. Tomorrow afternoon, we've got a couple sessions on workforce development issues focused on the Tech Hire Initiative out of the White House and LinkedIn's Economic Graph, both of which are trying to figure out how we rethink workforce development and use data to make those decisions. And we'll be featuring a few of the Startup in a Day cities. Startup in a Day is an initiative to get at this question. How do we better interact with businesses? How do we get them, make it possible for businesses to start up in 24 hours? I mean, now that doesn't always happen for all businesses. For the businesses where it should, and that may vary by community, they can get off the ground in less than a day. Purpose is, we all know it takes too long. How do we make it shorter in general? But we've got LA, San Francisco, and Boston, as well as Open Counter, are going to be on this panel talking about some of the specific tools that these cities are hoping to deploy to make that happen. I think for a lot of this conversation, they will put some real specificity to what those tools begin to look like. So again, thank you. Thank you to Scott and Microsoft for supporting us, and we look forward to seeing the rest of the summit. So thanks.